They said, "Just stay at the house. Mom, we're only going to look at the place. We'll be back before dinner." I said okay. I always said okay. That was the problem, wasn't it? 31 years of saying okay, and not one of them ever thought to ask if I meant it. It was a Thursday in March. My daughter-in-law had made pot roast the night before, which should have been my first sign that something was coming. She only cooked when she wanted something, or when she'd already taken it. My son had called 3 days earlier to say they found a place. A community, he called it. Not a nursing home, Mom, don't be dramatic. A community, with activities and a dining room and people your age. I told him I was 68. He said, "Well, it's never too early to plan ahead." I told him his father would have laughed at that. He didn't laugh. So on that Thursday, they drove me to what they called a quick tour. My daughter-in-law sat in the front seat. My son drove. I watched the back of their heads the entire way and thought about how strange it is to become invisible to people who used to need you to tie their shoes. The place was called Meadow Glen. It smelled like carpet cleaner and cafeteria soup and something floral that wasn't any flower I'd ever grown. A woman at the front desk smiled at me the way people smile at children who don't understand what's happening. My son spoke for me. He told her my name. He told her my age. He answered questions I could have answered myself. I looked at the rooms. I nodded when they expected nodding. When the tour guide asked if I had any questions, my daughter-in-law answered before I opened my mouth. "She's still thinking it over," she said, which was news to me. On the drive back, my son said they were going to stop for groceries. Quick errand. He'd drop me at the house first. I said okay. I sat in the kitchen for 2 hours before I understood they weren't coming back that evening. My son called at 7. His voice had that careful tone he used when he'd already decided something and was presenting it as a discussion. "The paperwork," he said. "It just made sense to go ahead and sign it while we were already there. You seem tired, Mom. We didn't want to put you through more back and forth. We paid the deposit. You can move in on the 1st. I held the phone and looked at the window above the sink. I'd replaced that window myself in 2009. Measured it, ordered the glass, had my neighbor help me set it. My son had been there that day. He'd handed me tools and eaten 3 sandwiches and said, "Mom, you can do anything." I said, "I'll call you back." I didn't call him back. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Not crying. I wasn't at the stage of crying. I was at the stage before it. The flat, quiet stage where things rearrange themselves in your chest and you understand something you should have understood earlier. I thought about the pot roast. I thought about how my daughter-in-law had packed a small bag for me for the tour just in case you need anything, she'd said, and how that bag had included 2 days' worth of my medications. That wasn't a bag for a tour. I went to my bedroom. I opened the closet. I looked at my things, the way you look at them when you're deciding what matters. I'd lived in this house for 22 years. I knew every creak in the hallway, every draft under the back door in January, every place where the paint had chipped, and I'd told myself I'd fix it later, and later had never arrived. I had a savings account my son didn't know about. I'd opened it the year after my husband passed, with the money from selling his truck. It wasn't a lot. It was enough to mean I had a choice. I pulled out my old canvas duffel from under the bed, the one I used for weekend trips when the grandchildren were small, and everything was still ordinary. I packed what I could carry. Clothes for a week, my medications, the small cedar box where I kept my important documents, the journal I hadn't written in for 2 years, and a photograph of my husband and me at Cape Hatteras in 1987. We were both laughing at something outside the frame. I never remembered what it was, but I liked that it existed. I called a cab from the landline. I didn't use my cell phone. I didn't want anything tracked. The driver was a young man who asked me once if I was okay, and then, when I said yes, left me alone. That was the kindest thing anyone had done for me that week. I told him to take me to the bus station. I had no plan beyond that, just the understanding that if I waited until morning, my son would be back with more careful reasoning, and his wife's organized folders and that same patient voice, and I would say okay again. I had said okay too many times already. I was done saying it. The bus station was quiet at 9 in the evening. A woman behind the counter was eating chips and reading something on her phone. I asked what was leaving that night heading west. She listed a few options. I chose Asheville. I'd been there once, 30 years ago, for a conference my husband had attended. I remembered the mountains being something I didn't want to leave. "One ticket," I said. "One way." She didn't blink. I sat in a plastic seat and waited for boarding. I kept my bag on my lap. I thought about my grandchildren. My older grandson, Marcus, was 16 and barely spoke to anyone. My granddaughter, Lily, was 12 and still called me on my birthday without being reminded. She was the one who sent me voice messages about her day, unprompted, just because she wanted to tell someone. Lily was the reason I left the cell phone on, just in case. But I turned off all notifications except hers. The bus left at 11:40. I watched the city lights thin out and disappear as we moved into the dark. I had $73 in my wallet, 2 credit cards, and a debit card for the account no one knew about. I had a duffel bag that held a week of my life. I had a window seat and no one next to me, and the first quiet I'd felt in months. I didn't feel brave. I want to be honest about that. I felt frightened and old and uncertain, and somewhere under all of that I felt something else. Something I didn't have a name for yet. I would find the name later. I arrived in Asheville just before 6 in the morning. The station was small. The air outside was cold and clean, the mountains just visible in the gray light at the edge of the sky. I stood on the sidewalk with my duffel bag and breathed. I walked 3 blocks to a diner that was just opening. A man in a green apron flipped the sign from closed to open as I reached the door. Inside, I ordered coffee and eggs and sat at the counter. The cook was a woman named Bet, which I knew because the other employee kept calling to her from the back. "Bet, we're out of sausage again. Bet, the coffee maker's doing that thing." Bet answered every time with a single sharp syllable that somehow covered everything. I ate slowly. I watched the morning come through the windows. By 8 o'clock, I had found a motel 2 streets over. $49 a night. The room had a single bed, a small television, and a window that looked at a parking lot. But the sheets were clean and the lock worked. I lay down without undressing and slept until noon. When I woke up, I sat on the edge of the bed and made a list in my journal. Not an emotional list, a practical one. What I had, what I needed, what came next, what I had. 12 days of motel money if I was careful. My medications, my documents, my debit card, a city I didn't know, no obligations. What I needed? A room I could afford longer term, a way to earn something, a reason to get up before 8. What came next? Everything. I found the weekly paper at a rack outside the motel office. I read the classifieds the way I hadn't since I was 26 and newly married and looking for an apartment. There was something almost funny about it. Almost. Under room rentals, I found 3 that seemed possible. I called all 3 from the motel phone. 2 didn't answer. The 3rd picked up on the 2nd ring. The voice was older, not fragile, just settled the way voices get when people stop performing for other people. She said her name was Ruth. She said the room was in her house on Olive Street. She said she was renting to one person only. No couples, no drama, no shoes on the carpet in the living room. I asked how much. She told me. I asked when I could see it. "This afternoon," she said. "If you can manage it." I managed it. Ruth's house was narrow and green, tucked between 2 taller houses like a book between bookends. The porch had wind chimes made from old silverware. The front door was unlocked when I knocked, and she called for me to come in from somewhere in the back. She was in the garden, kneeling beside a row of something leafy, wearing canvas pants and a flannel shirt with the sleeves pushed up. She was 73, I found out later. She didn't look it. She looked like a woman who had decided not to cooperate with aging, and aging had mostly backed down. She looked me over the way people look at used things they're considering buying. "You have references?" she asked. "I just got here," I said. "I don't have anyone to call." "Where from?" "Charlotte." "What's in Charlotte?" "My son," I said. He made a decision I didn't agree with. Ruth stood up and brushed dirt from her knees. Her expression didn't change. That's the most honest answer I've gotten from anyone who's knocked on that door. "Come see the room." The room was upstairs, small, but the window faced east, and the morning light must have been something. There was a bed with a white quilt, a dresser, a wooden chair, and a short bookshelf that still held someone else's paperbacks. I looked at the spines, old mysteries, travel writing, a battered copy of a novel I'd read years ago and loved. "It's fine," I said. "It's more than fine." Ruth looked at me again, measuring something I couldn't see. I don't need your whole story, she said, but I want to know one thing. You running towards something or just away? I thought about it honestly. Both, I said. Right now, mostly away. But I'm working on the other part. She nodded once, as if that settled it. I moved in the next morning. Ruth had rules. No music after 10. The kitchen was shared, but she cooked on Tuesday and Thursday. And if I wanted to eat, I was welcome to sit down. No guests without 24 hours' notice. She had a cat named Gerald who was not friendly and was not going to become friendly, so I should not try. I told her I had no intention of trying. Gerald glared at me from the top of the refrigerator, and I looked back without flinching. We understood each other. By the end of my first week, I had found a part-time job at a plant nursery 6 blocks away. The owner was a quiet man named Douglas who seemed mostly to be in conversation with his inventory and had little left over for people. He needed someone to handle the register and answer questions on weekends and the occasional weekday when he had deliveries. I told him I'd kept a garden for 20 years and knew my perennials from my annuals. He asked me one question about companion planting and then told me to come in Saturday at 8. I came in Saturday at 7:45. The work was easy in the way physical. Purposeful work is easy. People came in looking for something, and I helped them find it. I knew what grew well in shade, what needed drainage, what would survive a first-time gardener who forgot to water. By noon on my first day, I had helped a young couple choose everything for a new backyard and sent them home with more plants than they'd planned on and a handwritten list of instructions. Douglas appeared from behind a row of ornamental grasses. "You know plants," he said. "I know a lot of things," I told him. People just stopped asking. He went back behind the grasses. I took that as a compliment. My phone had been silent since I left Charlotte. Not entirely. There were calls from my son, messages from my daughter-in-law, a voicemail I listened to once and didn't save. His voice was not worried. It was inconvenienced. Words like irresponsible and concerning, and we just need to talk. The kind of language that sounds like care, but is actually about control. I had heard it before, from the same voice, and I had responded to it for too many years. I didn't call back. But on the 9th day, a text came through from Lily. It said, "Grandma, I don't know where you are, but I hope you're okay. Mom said you needed some space." That doesn't sound like you. I made the lemon cake you taught me last week. It came out really good. I wish you could have some. I sat with that message for a long time. Then I wrote back, "I'm okay, sweetheart. I'm somewhere quiet, and I'm doing fine. Your lemon cake is always good. I love you very much." She wrote back within a minute, "I love you too. Can I call?" "Not yet," I said. "But soon. I promise." She sent a small yellow heart. I saved it. I had not cried since leaving Charlotte. I cried a little then, not from grief exactly, but from the relief of being known by someone. It's a different thing, being known. It doesn't require geography. Ruth noticed I'd been quiet at breakfast. She didn't ask. She put an extra piece of toast on my plate and refilled my coffee without comment. Later, when I thanked her, she shrugged and said she just hated waste. I understood that she meant something different. By the 3rd week, I knew the nursery well enough that Douglas had started leaving me to open alone on Saturdays. He came in later, looked around to see that nothing had gone wrong, and usually went back to whatever he'd been doing. A woman who came in regularly for herbs told me I was the most useful person he'd ever had in the place. I asked how she knew. She said she'd been shopping there for 4 years, and this was the first time she'd ever understood what she was actually buying. At home in the evenings, Ruth and I ate dinner more often than not, at the small table in the kitchen. She cooked simply and well. I made things on Wednesdays and Fridays: soup, baked things, once a full roast chicken that Gerald sat beneath the table for, pretending not to be interested. Ruth didn't ask about my family for weeks. Then one evening while we were washing up, she said, without looking at me, "Whatever they did must have been something," I told her. "Not everything. The main shape of it. The tour, the deposit, the bag packed in advance, the paperwork already signed." Ruth dried a pan. She said, "My daughter tried to take my car keys last year. Told her if she touched them, I'd sell the car and buy a motorcycle." She believed me. "Do you know how to ride one?" I asked. "Not yet," she said. I laughed. The first time I'd laughed, really laughed, since March. A month in, a letter arrived at the house. Ruth handed it to me at breakfast with both eyebrows raised. The return address was Charlotte. My son's handwriting. I recognized it the way you recognize an old ache. Not the handwriting of a child, learning letters at a kitchen table while you stood over him with patience and a red pen. The same hands, a different person now. I opened it after dinner, alone in my room. He had written 4 pages. I read all of them. He talked about what was best for me, about worry and responsibility, and how hard it was to make these decisions. He talked about the deposit they'd put down, non-refundable. He talked about how this wasn't the way to handle things, as if the way to handle things had always been available to me and I had simply refused it. He did not say he was sorry. He did not mention the bag packed in advance. He ended by saying they were willing to talk, but that I needed to come home first. Home. As if home was something they'd built for me, instead of something I'd built around them for 30 years. I folded the letter. I put it in the cedar box with my documents, not because I treasured it, but because I thought someday I might want proof that I wasn't imagining things. The next morning I went to the nursery and repotted 17 small ferns. Douglas came in, looked at the ferns and said, "You repot when you're thinking." I told him that was a strange observation. He said he'd noticed a pattern. I told him, fine, yes, I was thinking. He went back to his greenhouse without pushing further. I liked that about him. 2 days after the letter, Lily called. I answered. Her voice was the same as it had always been, a little breathless, like she was always arriving somewhere. She told me about school. She told me her soccer team had won twice and lost once, and the coach had finally stopped making them do drills in the parking lot because someone's parent had complained. She told me she'd made the lemon cake again, and this time she'd added blueberries, and it was even better. I asked if she knew about the letter her father had sent. A pause. Yeah, she said. He told us he wrote to you. Are you coming back? No, I said. Another pause, different this time. Okay, she said quietly. Are you happy? I thought about Ruth and her garden and Gerald on top of the refrigerator and the east-facing window and the ferns at the nursery and Douglas and his one-sentence observations and the bus station in the early morning and the clean cold air when I'd stepped off and breathed. I'm getting there, I said. That's more than I was. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I want to come see you. Not with Mom and Dad, just me. I told her when she was ready, she should call first, and I would find a way. She said, okay. Then, Grandma? Yes? I'm glad you left. I think you had to. 12 years old. They surprise you, children. Not always when you want them to, but sometimes when you need them to. Exactly. 6 weeks after arriving in Asheville, I opened my own account at a local bank. The teller's name was James, and he was approximately the age of my son, and was perfectly professional, and I appreciated him more than he knew. I transferred money from the old account, keeping the old one open for appearances. I paid Ruth 3 months in advance. She told me I didn't need to do that. I told her I wanted to. She said, "You're staying then." I said, "I believe I am." She looked at Gerald, who had come in and was sitting on my shoe. Ruth said, "He never does that." I said, "I knew." She said, "Don't read into it." I said I wasn't. I was. At the nursery, Douglas asked one morning if I'd be willing to lead a Saturday workshop, basic container gardening for beginners. He'd been asked by someone in the community programs office, and he didn't want to do it himself. I said yes before he finished the sentence. 12 people came to the first workshop. A young couple trying to start a balcony garden, a retired man who'd just moved to an apartment and missed his yard, 2 women my age who came together and sat in the front and asked the best questions, a teenage girl who'd come alone and turned out to be the most knowledgeable person in the room after me. I stood in front of them and talked about soil and drainage and what plants could survive neglect and what couldn't, and about how sometimes the wrong pot ruins a perfectly good plant, and about how there's no shame in starting small. A window box, one good tomato plant, just something that grows because you tended it. Afterward, one of the women from the front row came up to me. She said, "You're very good at this." I told her I'd had a lot of practice explaining things to people who didn't know they needed to know them. She laughed. She said her name was Carol. She asked if I'd be doing more workshops. I told her I hoped so. She came back the following Saturday and brought a friend. The friend brought someone else. Douglas looked at the numbers and looked at me and said, "Next month we do 2. I told him fine. 3 months in, I drove back to Charlotte. Not to stay, not to discuss anything. I went on a Tuesday, alone, in a rental car, and I spent the afternoon at my house. My son had not changed the locks. I walked through every room. I touched things I'd chosen and things I'd been given, and things I'd bought at garage sales that had become more dear to me than anything expensive. I took what I'd come for. My grandmother's sewing box, a small oil painting my husband had bought from a street artist in New Orleans in 1994, a cast iron skillet I'd had since before my son was born, and a box of letters my husband had written to me in the first year we were married, when he traveled for work and I stayed home, and we wrote because long distance was too expensive. I also took the lemon cake recipe, which was written on an index card in my own handwriting and tucked into a cookbook on the third shelf. I had taught it to Lily from memory, but I wanted the card. I left a note on the kitchen table. It said, "I've taken a few things that are mine. I'm well. I've found somewhere good. I hope you can accept that in time. I love you, even now, Mom." I drove back to Asheville in the late afternoon. The mountains came into view just as the sun started dropping. I had a skillet and a painting and a sewing box and a box of letters and a recipe card, and I was going home. Home. There it was. The word had changed. That evening, Ruth made soup, and I contributed cornbread from the cast iron skillet. And Gerald came into the kitchen and sat in the middle of the floor and stared at the skillet like it was something he'd been waiting for. Ruth said, "Wherever you went today, it was good for you." I told her yes. I think it was. She ladled soup. Gerald made a sound of moderate approval. We ate with the windows open and the mountains dark in the distance, and the silverware wind chimes going quietly on the porch. And I thought about how a life can fold itself differently if you let it, if you stop waiting for the people who were supposed to unfold it for you. A letter came from Lily in April. Real mail, chosen stationery, the handwriting deliberate and careful. She'd pressed a flower from her garden between two pieces of wax paper and tucked it inside. A pansy, small and purple, barely held its color, but intact. She wrote, "Dad is still upset. Mom is Mom. But I talked to Dad last week, and I told him I thought he was wrong about what he did. He didn't say anything, but he didn't tell me I was wrong either. Maybe that's something." I wrote back on good paper. I told her about the nursery, about Ruth, about the workshops. I told her about the mountains and the silverware wind chimes and Gerald, who had recently begun sleeping at the foot of my bed with an air of total condescension. I told her I was starting to feel like myself again, a self I'd half forgotten, the one that knew what she wanted and said it. I wrote, "The bravest thing I ever did wasn't leaving. It was deciding very quietly that I was still worth something. I want you to know that early. You don't have to earn your place in a room. You were born with it." I sealed the envelope and walked it to the mailbox myself. The evenings were getting longer. Ruth had started a new garden bed on the west side of the house, and I was helping her plan it. Douglas had confirmed 2 workshops a month through the fall. The retired man from the first workshop, whose name was Philip, had become a regular at the nursery and had recently asked if I wanted to see the botanical garden on Sunday, which I had agreed to plainly, and Ruth had said nothing except that her sewing scissors were missing, and had I seen them, she hadn't been looking for scissors. I sat on the porch one evening in early May with a cup of tea and my journal. The town went by the way small towns do, unhurried. A dog, a couple walking close, a boy on a bicycle who was clearly in no danger of arriving anywhere soon. I opened the journal to a clean page. I had been meaning to write something for weeks, something I kept approaching and then setting down. I wrote it that evening. I said, "I spent years in a life that had my name on it, but not my shape. I was useful and present and capable and almost completely invisible. I made myself smaller so others could be bigger, and then was surprised to find that no one saw me anymore. I don't blame them entirely. You teach people how to treat you, and I had taught them that I had no edges. I have edges now. I am 68 years old, and I work in a nursery, and I live in a greenhouse on Olive Street, with a woman who lies about her motivations and a cat who pretends not to like me. I have a granddaughter who sends pressed flowers and letters. I teach people on Saturdays about what grows when you pay attention to it. I cook cornbread in a skillet my hands have known for 30 years. This is not the life I planned. It is the first life I chose." I closed the journal. The wind chimes made their small silver sound. The mountains sat the way mountains do, patient and enormous, entirely unbothered by the fact that it had taken me this long to find them. I finished my tea. I was not waiting for anything. And if this story found you at the right moment, the moment when you're sitting in someone else's version of your life, wondering if there's still time, there is still time, not for everything, but for the things that matter. You know which ones those are. You've known for a while. Start there.